Look, y'all already know me. I can't go anywhere without picking up a new piece of art, a little trinket, a poster, something for the crib. That's why the other art fair, that's a dangerous place for me. It's 4 days of independent artists, thousands of original artwork starting at around $100. Even if you're not trying to buy something, you can meet the artists, attend workshops and interactive installations, or, hang around for the mini golf, the DJ sets, and the fully stocked bar. Add the other art fair to your calendar. It's October 30th through November 2nd at Artifact Events in Ravenswood, and tickets start at just $20. Book your tickets online at theotherartfair.com. Look, it's already election season, my friends, and Chicago needs election judges for the March 17th primary. You can help your fellow Chicagoans cast their vote. You do have to be a registered voter in Cook County and a U.S. citizen, but you can earn up to $230 for your service. And if you speak Spanish, Hindi, Polish, Korean, Chinese, or Tagalog, then Chicago elections definitely needs your help. Help support communities across the city by serving as an election judge next year. Head to pollworker.chicagoelections.gov or call 312-269-7984. Today on CityCast Chicago, lawsuits against the Trump administration are coming down left and right. But do these legal actions actually help the city, and can they actually keep Chicagoans safe? It's Tuesday, October 14th. I'm Jacoby Cochran, and this is what Chicago's talking about. I am here with the ACLU-Illinois Ed Yohnka. Ed, welcome to CityCast Chicago.
Kobe, it's really good to be here. I'm a fan of the podcast, so I'm really happy to be here.
Y'all, we never pay people to say that. We are very grateful. Ed, there was obviously a lot of news coming out of federal courtrooms last week, but the biggest one was that a judge has temporarily blocked National Guard deployment in Chicago. I want to get your reaction to that news, but also can you kind of tell us what's next? Because I'm pretty hung up on that temporarily.
So let me start with, I think, the ruling itself, which was really quite profound. And what you heard was the judge really picking apart the rationalizations and the multiple rationales that the administration has offered for sending in federalized National Guard to Chicago and to the Chicago area. Even the lawyers for the government couldn't really pick one and stick with it. She also noted that, a lot of the situations in terms of people responding and reacting to ICE activity was not so much a violent protest as it was a reaction to violence that was actually conducted by ICE itself. She just said that the threshold for sending National Guards into Chicago had not been met and put a temporary restraining order into place. In terms of federal rules of civil procedure, that is often the way that goes. That is to say that, you get a temporary order, and then a week or so later, the judge begins hearings for a more permanent injunction. I would expect that would happen in this case. I think we can also expect that within hours, the government said they are going to appeal the decision to the Seventh Circuit. It's what they've done in Los Angeles and in Portland before Chicago. But I think for the moment, the most important thing is a court looked at these issues, looked at the claims of the government, really picked those apart, and was able to determine that we just don't have conditions here that are in any way an emergency that justify the introductions of more federal forces, including the National Guard.
We've seen a few of these injunctions so far, but, as a fan of the podcast, you have probably heard me be very cynical about whether these will actually do anything when the president and his administration have demonstrated they are looking for a way to run around the law. Like they do not care about these judges' rulings. They do not care about the pushback they've seen from even people in their own camp. And so do these legal injunctions actually change anything on the ground?
Think they do, Jacoby. And let me say, I think one of the things I get frustrated about at a national news level is that there are so many of these kinds of policies that this administration announces that nobody ever actually peels back to look at whether or not the reason that they announce this or say they're going to use a particular policy, whether or not any of that is in fact justified. And so, what is happening here in some measure is you're getting a public airing that show just how empty a lot of these assertions are that the administration makes. And I think that plays an important role when you look at what's happening across the country in terms of the broad opposition that is growing to the way in which the Trump administration is implementing its immigration enforcement policy, and secondly, this idea of introducing National Guards or other folks, into that enforcement process. Um, the other element, I think, of your question is the cynicism that I think many of us feel about the lawlessness of this administration and whether or not they would fail to abide by a court order. I think the problem that they have there, that the administration is going to have, is that the moment, they keep claiming this mantle of being, the ones who are protecting law and order, the ones who are, trying to act in a way that is responsible about public safety. I think once you have them, if they get to a place where they're not obeying court orders, that argument is harder and harder for them to make. And so I feel, at least somewhat confident that they do not want to put themselves in a situation where they're simply going to violate the law. Yes, they're going to scream about judges. They're going to hope that they get to the Supreme Court and that their luck will continue to hold there, and that, a majority of justices on the Supreme Court will rule in their favor. But it is a feature here that they are regularly and routinely losing in the lower courts. And I think that record, as time goes on, despite the rhetoric that they use about all of this, I think it's beginning to wear on Americans more broadly. And, they're seeing that this thing is just plain out of control.
As you point out, this is a sort of long process. There will be a lot of back and forth, emergency hearings, appeals. We've already seen in other courts, judges allowing for this administration to move forward with some of this lawlessness. And as you say, the growing pressure for them to, continue to justify the laws that they are breaking, all the while people are still being, harassed and kidnapped and quickly deported. How confident should people be in the idea that this process is going to play out in the way that is, most positive, I suppose.
Right. Or most just, I think, is the way that fair is the way that I often think about it, because you're right. These are slow processes that often grind through in ways that you still continue to have people experience harm while they're going out. And that, I think that's certainly something, that we're seeing. I think about the instance in Los Angeles when, the ACLU of Southern California and other lawyers got a court order that barred ICE from, conducting raids or interviews or investigations purely on the basis of race and the language that one spoke. And then the Supreme Court said, well, that could be a factor, so we're going to lift this stay. And I think that it was that was a sort of a heartbreaking thing in so many ways. On the other hand, we had about 6 weeks of time where ICE wasn't able to conduct those raids in that way. And so you anticipate that during that time, you're keeping some people from being harmed. I think that, we often think of litigation as it is not the perfect tool. It is a tool to do a limited thing in a limited space, but it is an important part of all the other building blocks that we have to push back against this authoritarian regime.
I mean, you mentioned the Supreme Court, Trump's packing of it. I mean, how confident should we be in these, temporary orders, in these 6-week stop measures, when ultimately a lot of this is running up into a Supreme Court that is, aligned with a conservative agenda?
I think that the thing we have to monitor is not, we're seeing the court act on this emergency docket and doing so in a way that is most favorable to the administration, right? Letting them, even as challenges go on, letting them take actions that many of us believe are just patently illegal. But all of that is to say that those are temporary rulings themselves, and they aren't the final decisions yet. And there are arguments to be made. There's pressure to be brought on the courts in terms of their own precedent, in terms of their own rulings. And I think that, that is part of this process that we're going through, all of which is also to note that it is just as important that people are out protesting. It is just as important that people are out expressing themselves. It is just as important that people are demanding from other, elected officials that we continue to, for example, keep in place the protections we have here in the state of Illinois for a whole range of things, including immigration, LGBTQ rights, abortion rights, education, etc. We have to continue that pressure at that level and continue to speak out, even while these legal processes are moving forward, sometimes in an uneven and frustrating way.
Fall is in full swing, which means fall theater season is back and cracking across the city. And I got another pick for you to look out for. Don't wait to secure your tickets to Timeline Theater Company's world premiere of hundreds and hundreds of stars. Motherhood, marijuana, and the multiverse collide in this story set in Chicago, exploring family, immigration, and identity. The play follows Clara, who's applying for U.S. citizenship ahead of a trip to Paris with her tween daughter, but Clara's application is unexpectedly flagged, threatening the only home she's ever known. We got a quote from the playwright and star Sandra Delgado, who says, "This is a very personal family tale, not unlike those playing out more and more every single day in Chicago and around the country." Now playing in a limited run through November 9th, this Timeline production is being hosted in the immaculate Looking Glass Theater space in the historic Water Tower Waterworks at Pearson in Michigan. Visit timelinetheater.com for more info and to get your tickets today. Seriously, the temps are dropping, the rain is coming, and you don't want to run out of time to replace your old, stuck, or drafty windows. Y'all already know what I'm about to say. Window Nation offers some of the best replacement windows out there. Plus, the installation crews are quick and effective, finishing a job in a day or less, and you can rest easy with Window Nation's lifetime warranty. And get this, right now you can make no payments for 2 years, no monthly payments, no down payment, and no interest until 2027. Protect your home into the future with high-quality windows from Window Nation. Schedule your fast free estimate now with the pros at Window Nation, and do it before October 31st to save big. Head to windownation.com. How do you feel that the administration essentially is painting this very conversation we're having as an insurrectionist conversation, that these rulings from judges and the judiciary at large itself is insurrectionist?
It's fascinating to me. The idea of the shifting of these terms like terrorists or insurrectionist or et cetera, is so strange, to be tarred with that brush simply because I don't agree with the policies of this administration. And I have to say, just as a personal aside, it's really baffling to me that one of the things that they cited in their recent memo about who insurrectionists and who, the folks that they were going to target included anybody who spoke out against capitalism or was anti-capitalist, when this administration is doing things that are anti-capitalist themselves, including, having the American government buy stock in companies and take over ownership of companies. But I always thought that was antithetical to capitalism, was to have the government picking winners and losers and deciding who owns TikTok and things of that nature. So I suppose I don't take that very seriously because I don't think they're very serious people when it comes to those definitions.
Much of our conversation right now has been focused on immigration, but there are legal challenges. I look at the New York Times; they have sort of a running list of
A
the
tracker, yeah.
various legal challenges, whether it's against Doge, funding cuts, mass firings, the going against environmental policies, the attack on trans people. Can our legal system handle all of this?
What's really, I think what gets, again, I think one of the things is, Jacoby, they can, and they're doing it. The ACLU alone is filed more than 160 lawsuits since Donald Trump was inaugurated, challenging a whole range of things. There's all these cases that are working their way through the courts in a completely normal way. I was in court in Chicago on Thursday, where the judge was issuing a ruling in a case that we're part of about the use of force by ICE on protesters, both at Broadview and at other places around Chicago. It was a completely normal court hearing. A judge ruled. She went through her ruling in detail. She asked questions of both parties. She took, that under advisement and issued her final order, limiting and restricting the ability of ICE to use that force. And it happened, and all of that took place in a completely normal, routine way. Just like court cases that I have seen argued, over the course of my more than 25 years with the ACLU of Illinois. So I think the courts can handle this.
And I mean, it may be normal for the courts, but it's not normal on the ground. You made this comment that like in many ways that these are not serious people, and I think when you look at the fact that it's being sort of led en masse by someone who is incoherent, and the fact that lawyers and courts can't stand up these fallacious arguments against evidence. But the truth is, the oppression of people has always been built on fallacious arguments that don't hold up against evidence. And this feels very serious when we're talking about agents firing tear gas and rubber bullets and shooting and killing people in traffic stops.
Yeah, I would completely agree with you that the harm is real, even if the people aren't serious. And I don't disagree with that. And we're still, as you point out, a lot of this oppression that we're seeing in a much bolder and bolder way. But it's part of the same oppression we've seen in a number of different ways for a number of different communities for generations and for centuries. They have just accelerated this in this way. I always say I get a little bit concerned sometimes when we start saying about how we want to preserve democracy or save democracy, because the reality is democracy hasn't worked for a whole bunch of groups for a long, long time. We need to do something better than the democracy that we have. And I think if people walk away from this period understanding that you had these folks who, as you say, using these fallacies and using these canards, created these policies that threaten us all, then we need to build better protections for our entire community. And we need to listen when communities are saying the way that they're under siege by oppressive policies, because for a long time, I think people dismissed that when it came to, routine police matters, for example, and just said, oh, we want our community to be safe. But we now see that when that argument is stretched to this extension, that keeping a community safe actually means oppressing it. We don't want that. So let's take that and apply that into other places where we can. And we should feel like we're moving forward from here, not stopping.
This episode is brought to you by Mubi, a global streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema. On Mubi, stream beautiful hand-picked films anytime, anywhere. Right now, you can stream Lurker, a sharp psychological thriller and the directorial debut of the Bear and Beef writer-producer Alex Russell. It follows a 20-something retail clerk who crosses paths with a rising pop star and slowly worms his way into their world, stan culture gone mad as the line between friend and fan blurs. Access and proximity turn into a matter of life and death. Y'all, I saw it at the Music Box about a month and a half ago. I ain't gonna lie, kind of creepy, real suspenseful. You're always kind of on the edge of your seat wondering what's gonna happen. You can watch Lurker and so much more exclusively on Mubi, and the best part, you could try it free for 30 days. Just head to mubi.com/citycast25. That's Mubi, mubi.com/citycast25.
Hi, I'm Michael Ziviak, Chief Revenue Officer of CityCast. Why do most of us want to learn a new language? It's because we want to speak it out in the real world with real people. Babbel gets you there fast. My daughter's a senior in high school, and after she graduates, we're taking a father-daughter trip to Spain. I know, she's spoiled, but that's on me. I'll be honest, my Spanish right now is pretty much tops out at "Donde está la biblioteca?" But when we get there, I want to actually talk to people, order food, and really connect with the locals, not just stumble through the basics. That's why I'm starting with Babbel. Learning a language with Babbel is all about small steps, big wins, and progress you can actually track and feel. And with how busy things get here at CityCast, I love that Babbel's bite-sized, 10-minute lessons fit perfectly into my day, whether it's between meetings or while I'm having coffee in the morning. I'm really excited to start picking up real-world Spanish before our trip so we can experience Spain in a more meaningful way. Right now, Babbel has a special deal for our listeners. Get up to 55% off your subscription at babbel.com/citycast. That's BABBEL.com/citycast for up to 55% off. Rules and restrictions may apply. Gracias and adios.
You mentioned, in addition to legal challenges, it's important for people to be out protesting, having their voice heard. The ACLU has also put out several Know Your Rights guides tailored to both immigration agents and military troops. Can you remind folks some of the, big ones they should know?
Yeah, absolutely. First, remember, your rights are your rights, and they don't change no matter who you're interacting with. If you're interacting with a local police officer, a state police officer, a federal official, or the National Guard, your rights remain the same. You have the right to be silent. You do not have to answer any question. You do not have to say who you are. You do not have to, engage in conversation with any of these folks in any way. You have the right to say that you want a lawyer and to ask for a lawyer from before you have any conversation with any of these folks as well. You have the right to ask if you're under arrest, and if you aren't under arrest or detained, to walk away and to leave the situation where you are. You have the right to actually film any of these officials doing their public duty in a public place. That's actually protected by the First Amendment to gather information about the government. So if you are seeing something, you have a right to take out your camera phone, record that, take a look at what's happening, and be able to use that video as a matter, as a vehicle for accountability, with any of these agencies. And of course, you have a right to gather with others and to protest. And, we're seeing that play out in a number of different situations, both in community where ICE is showing up and where they're engaged in, reckless and violent kind of enforcement. There's kind of these instant protests. There are the protests that we've seen at Broadview. And of course, there are the kinds of protests like we've seen on, Daley Plaza or the Federal Plaza in recent months, that we're obviously going to see more of going forward, including on October 18th with the No Kings rallies all across the country.
On a practical level, how can someone enact those rights when an agent is actually confronting them? I saw a video a few days ago of two young women sort of car packed in outside of a school, sort of being dragged out of a car. And in that moment,
Yeah.
it's tough to just be silent or say, give me a lawyer. And, they were responding in very different ways. Like, what is a person to do who may have varying, legal status when they are being, accosted by, folks in military fatigue and assault weapons?
I'm glad you asked this in this way, because I think it's one of the other things we have to be real about and authentic about with people is we know, based on LA, based on Washington, D.C., based in other things that we're seeing right here in the Chicago area, that these agents and these federal officials are not always respecting people's constitutional rights. And so therefore, each of us may make a different risk calculus in that circumstance about what we say or how we respond or what we do. What, we would encourage people to do is to, first of all, to be safe, to not put themselves in a situation where they're the next person, being shot by these officers, as we've seen. And instead, just to collect as much information, hopefully somebody is recording it, because that puts organizations like the ACLU and other legal groups in a place to challenge those actions later, in a way that I think is really important. But you want people to be careful, because we know that these officers, led by people like Greg Bavino, are just not interested in protecting other people's rights.
With all that in mind, and from your vantage point, what do you think the strategy here is for city and state leaders?
So I think there's three things that we're seeing from leadership, and we need to continue to see from leadership, that I think are critically important. The first is they need to remain unified in opposing this invasion, really, of our community by these federal forces, and calling it out. I think that's one of the things that has been effective here in Illinois, is the fact that you've had this kind of unified front from public officials. The second thing is I think they need to continue to lift up the stories of people who have been impacted, of community members who, as you are pointing out, are being harmed in real time. And we're seeing that. I think continuing those stories, continuing to point out the real human costs of this operation, is incredibly helpful. And then the third thing is I think that they need to look for places and times in which they can build on the kinds of protections that we put in place here in Illinois and in Chicago in particular, to add to those, to help protect people from further harm. The Trust Act, and the Welcoming City Ordinance, that means that police don't interact, and assist ICE in these operations, are good. Our friends at the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights have talked about ways to strengthen that. So I think that, when you look at those activities together, I think that the elected officials, can play an important role, but they need to be stern, they need to be strong, they need to be united, and they need to be continuous in terms of both calling out the harms and lifting up people to ensure that we're recognize who it is that's being harmed.
You talk about some of the policies instituted. I think about Johnson's executive orders trying to protect Chicago and ban ICE from staging on city properties. And I understand, I don't want it to sound flippant when I say, much of this feels like a rhetorical response, but it sounds like there is no ability for them to, like, for example, I think of that raid in South Shore. We've mentioned it a few times over the pockets. It doesn't sound like there's any other way that city or state lawmakers can prevent these kind of actions. Like, it doesn't sound like they can stop them from tear gassing folks in neighborhoods flippantly, or, keep them from racially profiling people. It feels like much of this is everyone, banding together, protesting, standing up vocally, but really, it sounds like a lot of this falls on the court system, that is our only, and sounds like last hope in standing up against this lawlessness.
I sort of think of it in reverse, Jacoby. I think the courts are our first stop in deflecting, distracting, and delaying some of the harms. But I think the things that you're talking about, people gathering together, public officials looking for other steps that they can take, executive orders, legislation, etc., but also using their platforms for storytelling and making clear what the harms are to build further opposition to these policies. That's the long term. That's the place where we're going in terms of fighting this. I mean, I'm sure that your listeners have heard all of this, data that people talk about, that once a democracy begins to backslide into authoritarianism, there's a better and even chance they'll go all the way to dictatorship. The only thing that interrupts that backslide is people power, is people actually speaking out, taking action, voting, going to the streets. And I think that all that what the court system is doing and the way it's functioning is creating a delay and creating narratives for people to become engaged with so that they take those actions, so that elected officials take action, so that we all work together in concert to oppose the further backslide of our democracy. I often say the courts aren't coming to save us. There's nobody coming to save us but us. And I think that is the place where, we can use the courts as part of telling that story, as part of building support, as part of creating community. But in the end, it really is the community that needs to go out and speak out and protest and be heard.
I really appreciate you making time to join CityCast Chicago. From ACLU-Illinois Ed Yohnka, it has been a great time talking, my friend.
Thank you, Jacoby. Anytime. I love doing this.
Before we get out of here, we are still thanking new CityCast Chicago neighbors. So much love to Michael G, Jessica H, Ben A, Kevin M, Matt B, Caroline J, Christina C, Katie M, Christina B, Alexandra H, Elizabeth M, Emil B, and Forrest D. We appreciate all of the love and support y'all have shown the podcast and the newsletter. Again, even if you was just signing up so you can get your hands on the tote bag, we appreciate the coin. We gonna keep it. We gonna put it to good use. Of course, we can't close the door without some good news. The 61st Annual Chicago Film Festival is back tomorrow through the 26th. Over 125 films, special tributes to folks like Nia DaCosta and Spike Lee. They're going to have special film presentations, some very can't miss premieres. Already, you got to go on standby to get tickets to them. Criterion Closet going to be in the city. Y'all, this is the longest running competitive film festival in North America. It's touching down in the city for the next 11 days. I'll drop a link in the show notes. As always, we appreciate you for listening and reading. We're going to be back bright and early tomorrow. We'll talk to you then. Peace.